Well, I got to looking at things a little bit this afternoon, and by my count, I think I only have about 3 class periods left, and we have 3 chapters left. So, you're going to have to pick and choose what we focus on in each of these 3 chapters over the course of the next 3 class periods so that we can try to make it to the end of the book to the best of our ability. So we're in Ecclesiastes 10 tonight, and really just beginning it. I said we were going to start it on Sunday, and we didn't. So we're beginning it this evening. So I guess I'll open up first by asking, are there any specific things in chapter 10 that jumped out at any of you that you definitely were thinking this is something we ought to discuss? Because we can start there and then we'll just kind of go from that spot. I don't know that I ran into too much in chapter 10 that really sparked a lot of extra thought or interest in me, but certainly did in chapter 11 a little bit, which we'll talk about, hopefully, Lord willing, on Sunday. But anything in chapter 10? In the questions I asked from the perspective of, are these statements that are made in this chapter, and really the book as a whole, are they the examples that are used intended to be exhaustive, or are they representative? Are they intended to give us the full scope of what he's talking about, or to nail down a specific single application of a principle, or are they kind of more general statements that give us a principle that might be applied in a whole lot of different areas? I think it's general. And for example, in the first section, when he says, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, and a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. I mean, we hopefully when we read verse 1, we understand the first half of that verse. I mean, what's he saying? I mean, I know it's literally what he says, but what's the point? If we're going to make this a more general application of things as opposed to a specific instance, like for example in this verse, he compares the fly in the perfumer's ointment causing it to stink to a little folly mixed in with wisdom and the problems that creates. But just generally speaking, what's the principle for us to understand?
They should have a little bit of that.
Okay, and that goes back to what we talked about before. What was it in chapter 7 maybe? Where he talked about don't be overly righteous, don't be overly wicked. And we talked about the meaning of those verses. But here is just the idea of having a little bit of bad does what? Aaron had to bail on me for a minute, and now I'm echoing. Echo. Let me pull that down a little bit and see if that makes a difference. Maybe I've just got it too close to my big mouth. I don't know. Somebody said something, but I mean, what's? Yeah, well, no, I think it was you. A little bit of bad can ruin good. Let's talk about some specific examples. We talked in an earlier chapter about reputation. Trust got brought up in that discussion. And what was one of the points that we made in talking about that would apply in this particular instance? you're a mostly trustworthy person, but you betray somebody's confidence, what happens to that trust and the fact that you are generally a trustworthy person?
It depends on how bad it was betrayed, but in most cases, the other part's not very bad.
Yeah, I mean, it's immediately out the window, and then the hopes of regaining it are a slow go. It takes a lot of extra effort to overcome the one bad thing that we do, and so it becomes all the more important for us to be careful about our actions and about our words, because I mean the reality is we all make mistakes, but we need to be really careful about how we approach people, because a little bit of bad, I mean, we can be a really genuinely, generally speaking, a good person, very trustworthy, somebody who has a reputation for doing good work, all those kinds of things. And if we're not consistent in that to the point that we should be, and we allow laziness or anger, frustration, whatever it is, to creep in and I don't want to say cause us, but be kind of a catalyst for us doing something or saying something we shouldn't say. That one act can do a great deal of damage. We'll talk a little more in chapter 11 about the danger of doing nothing, which is one response that we might have to the fact that we could do so much damage by such a small act. But I mean, I think the point in verse 1 is, I mean, a single fly. It doesn't sound so bad, right? I mean, I see lots of flies daily. Leave my windows open when I go into a house to do HVAC work and come back out and it may have 3 or 4 flies in it. I roll my windows up, turn the air conditioning on, and then I got to deal with the flies. But one fly can cause the perfumer's oil to stink, and a little bit of folly, it doesn't take much, can ruin all of the wisdom and all the good things that we're trying to do. Liz, you have something?
I think it's the same concept that Jesus talks about when a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And in verse 18 of chapter 9, wisdom is better than weapons, but one sinner destroys much good. It's the same thing. It only takes one action to mess a whole lot of things up. And God doesn't condemn us for a single mistake. He's not going to, unlike in Bible times, he's not going to strike us dead for a mistake. But our mistakes have lasting consequences that sometimes we don't even see.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, God's a great deal more understanding than we tend to be, which is really interesting considering he's the only one who's never what? He's never sinned, he's never offended somebody by his actions, he's never done anything evil. I've said before, it's really amazing when you look at the example of Jesus, that he could look at people who struggled with sin the way that we do and have such a great amount of compassion for them and understand their nature, when the reality is he's the only one who's ever walked on the planet that ever lived a perfect life. He never sinned. And yet he's so compassionate and so understanding when it comes to those who have and do. We, on the other hand, whose lives have been filled with sin, someone offends us or says, whether it's they say something or do something that bothers us, hurts our feelings, whatever phrase you want to put in there, we want to hold it over their heads forever as though, this is the worst possible thing that could have ever happened and you're a horrible person. And it doesn't make sense. And yet that's the case. And so we have to use a great deal of care. And again, the point is not, better not to say anything or better not to do anything than to perhaps make the mistake or commit the sin and have all of the good that we've been doing ruined, that's not the point. The point is just the importance of exercising great care in what we do, because it doesn't take a lot of bad to mess up all the good that we're trying to accomplish and that we're trying to stand for. And that becomes this, I mean, it's important anyway, but it becomes especially important when we're talking to people in the world. Greg.
So this creates a dilemma.
Yes.
In that I believe the admonition is, to me personally, to be guarding my influence and preserving my influence. Whereas the judgment that I have for others, I need to be liberal in forgiveness and generous in overlooking the faults of other people.
Yes.
What happens often is that because of our fear and concern over our reputation, it's not that we don't do things as much as we conceal the faults that we have, which prohibits us from being open and honest with the fact that we're not perfect in every way in all times.
Right.
That dehumanizes us. We're actually more real, we're actually more genuine in nature when we can share that we have sullied our own reputation, when we have made choices that have harmed our ability to influence other people. So we walk this bizarre cadence where we don't want to be overemphasizing, well, we're all just, flawed, we all have the flies in the ointment. We want to exhibit good characters and good traits, but we also fail to take advantage of being more relational with one another because of our concern over what one error might do to our reputation.
Right.
And so that kind of puts it upon me to make that distinction, and I would conclude, be a lot harder on myself than I am on everyone else in regards to this matter.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not typically the way it goes. But I mean, you're right. That is the approach that we ought to take. While not dismissing the fact that wrong has been committed by other people, at least being more understanding and compassionate of the fact that they struggle with whatever it is they struggle with, and we may not struggle with the same thing. And I think that's the other thing that's always kind of amazing to me is we have a tendency to look at the sins of other people and we think, well, how in the world is that? How's that a problem for you? Because it's not a problem for me. And yet at the same time, we don't recognize the fact that we also have our own struggles and sins and stumbling blocks that are in our way that we struggle with that they may not have any problem with whatsoever. And so all of us are works in progress. We all struggle, and Greg's right. The more transparent we can be, the stronger and deeper our relationships will be with one another in the church, and therefore the ability to be stronger together in the way that the Scripture teaches. But it also makes us more effective with people in the world, because it allows us to share with them our own struggles and experiences, perhaps helping them with the same kinds of struggles in their own life. But it also makes us, as Greg said, more relational and less looking like these people who have it all together and they've got it all figured out, and I can just never be like that. Well, it's probably okay that you can't be like that, because none of us are either. None of us have it all figured out. We all struggle in various ways, and sometimes even when we think we've got certain battles or sins or temptations or struggles conquered, they raise their ugly head again later. Maybe later that day, maybe later that week, maybe years from now. And so none of us are beyond making these kinds of mistakes. We need to work on being more perfect as God himself is perfect. But at the same time, recognize that all of us are sinners in need of the grace of God and in need of one another's grace from time to time. Anything else about those first few verses? What does he mean in verse 3? Even when a fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. So that means he's just walking up and down the road saying, I'm a fool, I'm a fool, I'm a fool. Jim?
Yeah, I've counted these 12 chapters. It's been mentioned before. I've counted it 24 times in Solomon talk about the fool, and in this chapter is about 5 times. And he lets us know that the fool puts his ignorance on display in a magnified manner.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I made the ridiculous statements. You walk up and down the street saying, I'm a fool, I'm a fool, I'm a fool. The reality is it's not what he says, it's what he does, it's how he lives. And as Jim said, he basically has it on display for everybody to see. And so by his conduct, people look at him and say, what a fool. Whether they say those words exactly or just recognize the folly in the way that he lives and the things that he says and all of that, he is displaying it for everyone to see as he walks down the road. Anything else about those first 4 verses? Did anything come to somebody's mind that
Yes.
you're like, oh yeah, I was thinking about chapter 10, this? Yes.
So I spoke a few weeks ago about do not let the left hand know what the right hand is doing in regards to one's good works.
Right.
And I said there was a Jewish frame of thought suggesting that the right hand was the holy, righteous part of the man, and the left hand being the more carnal part of the man. Well, here is a Bible verse that supports that notion. It's not, again, a set-in-stone idea,
Right.
but there is credibility to the idea that as one is talking about don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing, it's don't let your prideful self get a big measure of what your charitable side was up to, and lessen the experience for yourself by becoming prideful.
And that is I don't know, maybe it's not for everybody, but I mean, that is a struggle, is it not? To do good for people and not at least on some level want some kind of recognition for it or hope that other people find out about it or however that ends up working out. And then we struggle with this idea of, well, I mean, look at me, I'm a good person, I do good deeds for other people. And so Greg talking about trying to separate these 2 personas essentially, and I mean, it is there are a lot of passages that deal with this idea of being really careful about who it is we're trying to please and who it is we're trying to impress. Jesus deals with that idea extensively in Matthew chapter 6 in talking about fasting and prayer and giving alms and all of those things. And it's not saying don't do them publicly in ways that other people might see it. It's just talking about the importance of making sure we keep our motives in check and that we're not doing it for the praise of men. And again, that is a thing that's easy for us to say, well, that's not why I'm doing this. I'm not doing this to impress people and all of that. But it's perhaps a little harder thing to actually put into practice and keep our motives pure and clean. We always want to justify ourselves. I mean, that's just, nobody wants to feel like they're constantly doing wrong or that they have wrong motives. And so we try to find ways to justify our behavior or our words. But God's not fooled. God's not mocked. And so it becomes really important for us to use a great deal of care in making sure that our motives are pure and that we're trying to honor and glorify God. There's several contradictions kind of in the, or not contradictions per se so much as just this middle section. There's an evil that is I've seen under the sun, as it were, an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I've seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. Again, is this about the status of people in the world? In the sense that, I mean, and obviously that's an application, but what's the general principle that's being talked about here in this particular place? Perhaps. Maybe it's not, maybe it's just the specific application. But entertain with me for a moment the fact that it might be a general principle as opposed to just a specific application. What does it mean that we see folly set in many high places? Okay, why is that surprising? Because what we've been talking about throughout this whole book.
He's just saying that life often defies our expectations.
Okay, and is that true? Yeah, and we've talked about this a little bit before already in Ecclesiastes. But I think in some ways it may be even harder for us as people of God. I guess it could be described as harder and easier, depending on what your vantage point is. But I think it could be more difficult for us as people of God because we are made aware of the truth, not a truth, but the truth. And we know the truth about God. We know the truth about God's promises with regard to what happens to the wicked. We've already talked about it in this book. He will not prolong his days. He will not prosper. Do the wicked sometimes prosper? So we read those statements and we see those themes throughout Scripture. Not just in Ecclesiastes, but all over both Old and New Testaments. And then we see, I mean, God's faithful, right? God's always true. God always does what's right. God always stands behind what He says and keeps His word. And so if all those things are true, and God says the wicked won't prosper, then what does our mind do with that? When we see the wicked prospering, what does Satan want us to believe? God lied. God's not keeping His word here. Here's this wicked person who's prospering when God says the wicked don't prosper. So what's mistaken in this instance? Maybe our reading of the text in the first place, but what else? Huh?
What is prosperous?
Yeah, what is prosperous? What does prosperity look like? Maybe, Andrew's talked about this already. God's view of our physical circumstances is grossly, vastly different than ours. And as Angie said, what's prosperity? I mean, what you view as prosperity, God may view as a curse. And so, we tend to reflect on things based on our own understanding. Why would we do that? Who else's understanding are you going to reflect on it with? I mean, really. I mean, just being honest. I mean, who else's understanding are you going to reflect on it with? I mean, your understanding is the only thing you've got. Unless you've got the Word of God, and then you can reflect on that too. But does God's understanding of things always match what our understanding of things is? And what's the difficulty for us? Because again, do we want to think we're wrong?
We want to take our own understanding.
Yeah, we want to take our own understanding because why do we want to do that?
Because we want to think we're right.
Because it makes sense to us. What was that, Margaret?
We like to think that
We like to think we're right. I mean, there's some sense in which I think it's a natural thing that we want to feel like we're doing the right thing. And Samantha said we do it because it makes sense to us. And so we want to cling to that. And you know, while we would never say it, there's some sense in which that way of thinking is seeking to make God like who? Who do we want God to be like? We want Him to be like us, and more specifically than be like us, we want God to be like me. I want Him to think like I do, right? I want Him to understand things the way that I do. Why don't you see this? And so we want to mold God essentially into our own image, when the Bible clearly teaches that whose image is whose? We're the ones who are supposed to be molded in His image. We were created in His image in the very beginning. And as people of God, Romans 8 teaches that we are to be conformed to the image of His Son. And so this is not about boxing God's way of thinking or God's understanding of things into ours. It's about a willingness. I think Andrew in his prayer tonight talked about the idea of us being moldable, allowing ourselves to be shaped and molded by the will of God, and to make those applications. And so the goal is ultimately for God to mold us and to alter our thinking. Now, here's the crux of the matter. Are we ever going to have the level of understanding of things that God does? And we might say, well, not in this life, but the reality is, not in the next life either, because we're not going to be gods. We're going to be people of God. We're going to be present with God, but we're not going to be God. So we're never going to have the level of understanding that God does. So what do we do in that situation? If the goal, I said, was to mold, to have our understanding and our will molded into God's will and God's understanding, but then I say, well, but we're never going to have the level of understanding God has. It's like, well, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth. So what do we do in the instances where we don't have and cannot obtain, cannot gain, because of who we are and the finiteness of our existence? What are we to do when our understanding and God's understanding of things just don't match? What is the key? This is essential. Yes. I mean, it is essential that we develop the kind of relationship with God that even though we may look at life and it's painful and it's difficult, and sometimes it just doesn't make any sense at all, and everything seems upside down and inside out, the key to overcoming that and to existing here, and more importantly to having the hope of eternal life and the life to come, is that when my understanding and God's don't align, and when it reaches a point where there's a level of understanding needed that I'm never going to be able to obtain and attain to, that we learn to trust in God in spite of the fact that this seems completely backwards, and in spite of the fact that at times it seems as though God says this, and yet the world is like this. I appreciated Angie's comment about, well, what is prosperity? Because what that reveals to us is that sometimes we're asking the wrong questions, right? And we're viewing things from the wrong perspective. We're viewing it from our understanding. And so in our mind, the way things are versus the way God said they should be or would be don't match up, and therefore God must have lied or He's contradicting Himself. The problem's not with what God said. The problem's not with what I'm seeing. It's not a matter of me lying to myself and saying, well, what I think I see, I'm not really seeing. It's a matter of understanding that I just don't understand in this point, at this point, in this circumstance, what's going on, and the fact that I see an apparent contradiction between what God said and what reality is not God's fault, it's mine, and I'm just going to have to trust Him. And that is a big theme in the book of Habakkuk. It's probably one of my favorite books. But the theme of Habakkuk is chapter 2, verse 4. Because like Job and like a lot of other people in the Bible, see, it's really interesting because we read Job and we get it, right? We read Job, we understand. Because we know what's going on. Job never gets to see that. Habakkuk has questions he asks God about, and God says, okay, here's the answer. And Habakkuk says, now I'm even more confused than I was before. To which God responds to that, you're just going to have to trust me. Chapter 2, verse 4, the theme of Habakkuk is the just, the righteous will live by faith. You're going to have to trust me. I'm not going to explain every detail of what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to explain to you why I'm doing it the way that I'm doing it. I'm not going to be able to explain to you on a level that you're going to be able to understand and appreciate why it is that I'm using the Chaldeans to punish you, and your people. I'm not going to be able to explain that in a way that's going to make sense to you. So you're just going to have to trust me. God doesn't say it in that many words, but the reality is that's the experience that we face in this life. And that is a big theme of Ecclesiastes that I don't know that I ever really saw until this time around. And that is this repeated theme. We're going to see it again before the book is over. That there's so much in life that is out in front of us, and some of it stuff that's going on right now that we don't have the ability, no matter how much wisdom we gain or how much experience we have, there is an inability on our part to really fully grasp what's going on in the big picture. And certainly when we get out beyond today and what's going on in the world right now, to think about what's going to be going on 10 or 20 or 30 years from now is an impossibility. And we are going to destroy ourselves as people if we think we can ever gain the level of wisdom that we need to figure all of it out so that we can perfectly plan out the course of our lives and the lives of those that we love. It's not going to happen. And we'll drive ourselves crazy trying, and then we'll drive ourselves crazy afterwards because we've made all these great plans, and then what happens to them? Inevitably, we can't follow through the way that we wanted to because circumstances didn't turn out the way we had hoped or the way we had planned for them to happen. So life is about living here, living now, honoring God, and realizing that in the mess that is life, that we can't really fully grasp all of these things that don't make sense to us. We're just going to have to trust God and His goodness and His faithfulness and all of that, and realize that His understanding is much greater than ours. And He is faithful and He is right, and He cares about us, and He's going to provide. Jim.
Now that verse 4 there about if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, sometimes those of power arise against you, but you need to learn not to try to get smart with a police officer. If you do, you might wind up like the country singer. I fought the law and the law won.
Well, and verse 4 is an interesting verse. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, is the way that the English Standard Version renders it. I've got the NET on my phone. I was trying to keep that available just because I do like the difference in the way it's rendered in some places. If the anger of the ruler flares up against you, do not resign from your position. So in this case, it sounds more like the idea of you are someone who is in the court of the king, working for the king. Don't resign your position. But I mean, both of them mean the same thing. For a calm response can undo great offenses. I want you to think about that for a minute. How is that true? And again, is it always true?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind is Proverbs 15:1.
Okay.
I don't know if that would relate at all to what you just said there, but that's what came to my mind.
What is Proverbs 15?
Soft
answer turns away wrath.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, is this intended to be just a blanket statement? If you will remain calm, isn't that like on all these? I mean, I'm sure it's a decade old now, but be calm, and then they finish the rest of the phrase with something else. Be calm and get a Starbucks. That's not one of my other things, but probably is, because Starbucks is everywhere. But does it follow that if you just remain calm, or you provide a soft answer, you're going to diffuse every single situation, and everything's just going to smooth out? No, they're not intended to be blanket statements. But which has the greater likelihood of reaching a more desirable conclusion? Turning around and in this case, abandoning your post as the person who works for the king. How's that going to turn out for you? I mean, at least most kings I have any knowledge of their history, probably not so well. Well, so you just turn and shout in his face, right? That works out well. No. So the likelihood of you getting a response from the king that's going to be profitable and favorable on your behalf is speaking calmly. And this is, again, uses the example of a king. But is it intended to just talk about people? Well, I mean, I don't work in a king's court, so this doesn't apply to me. Just generally speaking, in life, these are principles that we can apply. And resigning your position doesn't have to mean an official post that you have, which is one of the reasons I kind of like the English Standard Versions, do not leave your place. Well, maybe you're a citizen that's brought before the king, and the king has rebuked you sharply, and he's saying, well, don't walk away. Don't just resign yourself to the fact that you're at the king's mercy. You are, but seek a response that might lay the offense to rest. And again, this is not about manipulating or clever words or crafty speeches. This is about just calmly responding in a way that's reasoned and measured, in hopes of bringing about a resolution. What about this next section, a little further down, in verses 8 and following? He who digs a pit will fall into it. Well, I hope not. I mean, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them. He who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it's charmed, there's no advantage to the charmer. I'd say not. So what is the point of that section? Again, I think there are examples given to reflect a general, maybe more than one general principle. But what is the point of this section? Is it really about digging a pit?
All of these tasks are things that sometimes you have to do.
Okay.
And yet there's risk involved. And if you were trying to live your life, well, I don't want to do anything that would cause me danger, you can't avoid it. So that's the thing I immediately think of is the Bible I'm reading puts a header on this whole chapter and calls the whole chapter a little foolishness. And so I just think that this is sort of a collection of, you'd like to think you could live your life avoiding all these dangers, but you can't. You're gonna find yourself needing to dig a hole, and you might get hurt.
Yeah, and I mean that is a great general principle for us to understand, and I think most of us do. But the reality is, as Andrew said, there are people who think, well, I just won't go outside because I don't want to take the risk of whatever. I'm not going to, I really want to go see this relative who lives here, or I want to go see this place, but I'm not going to get on an airplane because there's a great deal of risk involved, or I'm not going to get in a car because, car wrecks happen all the time. And so we might be inclined to have this idea that I'm just going to be really careful and not do any of those things that might have a great deal of risk involved with them, or even a small amount of risk involved with them, because I don't want to risk the pain, the injury, or death. But the reality is that there are even simple tasks that we have to be involved in that have risk. I mean, there's risk involved in practically everything, and we can't avoid or hope to avoid some of the dangers that exist in this life by just trying to use our wisdom and hedge ourselves up. Jim, you had something?
Yeah, he said, a dull light to use more energy.
Yeah.
Well, Solomon's telling us, why not use common sense, sharpen your axe, you'll use less energy to won't be so tired at the end of the day.
Work smarter, not harder, right? I mean, that can be said in a whole lot of areas, and there's some sense in which when we have wisdom in those areas, we do have tools at least that allow us to work more efficiently and more effectively.
And I was going to say along that line too, even though there is that risk, wisdom would tell you to minimize the risk where you can.
Sure.
A sharp axe isn't just easier to use, but it can be safer. A sharp knife when you're preparing dinner is safer because you're not trying to force everything to cut,
Right.
and you end up cutting your fingers. So there's wisdom in trying to mitigate risk where you can.
Sure.
I think Aaron taught a lesson about taking the guard off a circular saw recently, something along those lines.
So, I mean, yeah, those two principles kind of go hand in hand. When we use tools more effectively, we reduce risk. But again, going back to Andrew's first point, do we ever eliminate it? If you're going to cut with a circular saw, is there any way what is the only way to eliminate risk with cutting with a circular saw? Don't cut with a circular saw. But if you've got to cut something, what else might you use? A handsaw. Is there risk involved with that? Nobody ever has an injury with a handsaw, right? Well, what if you decide, well, too much risk with that, I'll try. It doesn't matter what you name. If you've got to cut something, even if, to look at Andrew's last statement, a butter knife, they're not very sharp, right? If you use a butter knife to cut something really tough, is there risk involved? I mean, there's still risk. It may be smaller, but there's still risk, and so the importance of that. Did you ring the bell? Oh, I thought you were ringing. I saw you standing back there. So I'm like, did the bell already ring and I'm just standing here gabbing without stopping? That's not unusual. But, okay, if there's anything else about chapter 10, we will start class with Speak Now or Forever Hold Your Peace. And then we will move to chapter 11. So, and I mean that. If you really want to talk about something in chapter 10, I'm not going to just skip it. But if you don't bring up something because it's not that important to you, then we will probably go ahead and move forward to chapter 11. And I will work to have the questions printed for Sunday so that you can get those for chapter 12 and the conclusion. So appreciate the comments tonight and look forward to continuing our study in Ecclesiastes.